out if you got any further questions.
Good. If anybody doesn't hear me, let me know so I raise my voice. And also welcome. I'm Arifa Akbar. I'm the former arts editor of Tortoise. So it's great coming back to this room. I'm now at The Guardian. I've been immersed in arts for many years, and we're here to talk about the arts and decolonising them, arts and heritage. But before we do, or maybe as we go along, maybe we want to figure out what we're talking about when we're talking about decolonising, because that's a big word, and it's brought a lot of you here. So perhaps we can discuss that along the way, or define our terms if we want to use a technical term, and then talk about the why. So why arts institutions need decolonising, and then the how this might happen, how it might already be happening, or how it's not happening. It's not quite happening as we'd want it to. So we're going to get into all that quite quickly. Before we do, I just want to send out a quick reminder of what we're doing with this ThinkIn format. And it's a discussion that involves the whole room, not just the fantastic panel we've collected here of speakers, but it's as much about you as them. And they are going to be contributing alongside you, and I'll introduce you to them in a minute. But the idea here is that what's said here in this room will ideally feed into a more dynamic kind of journalism for Tortoise. So the traditional news agenda is decided by a small set of editors who sort of try and figure out what it is, what the news points of the day are. And what we're doing is we're formulating that news here with you all, and find things that hopefully will power the journalism of Tortoise. The very quick house rules, I'll go through them quickly. It's an hour long. It's exactly an hour long. There's several screens that show the tortoise, the tortoise at the beginning. When the tortoise reaches the end, it's the end. There are. Would you be kind enough not to ask questions, because this is a different kind of discussion. So it's comments, not discussions. Would you mind introducing yourself just the first time you talk? There's cameras here, and they are filming, but they're unobtrusive. And would you mind putting your phones on silent? I've just remembered to do mine. Now, I want to introduce you to the experts. They're in a huddle here, so let's unravel them. There's Subhadradas at the end there, a historian, writer, and museum curator at UCL Culture. and sometimes comedian. So that might kick in tonight. There's Dr. Errol Francis over here, who's Artistic Director and CEO of Culturand. And you might want to tell us more about Culturand as we go along. There's Melanie Keane right here, who is on the nearest to on left of me, Director of Wellcome Collection now, but was previously Director and Chief Curator of INEVA, and INEVA is the Institute of International Visual Arts. And we have in the middle there Priya Kanchandani, who is the editor of Icon magazine, which is a magazine of architecture and design, but has also been curator, writer, previously worked at the V&A and also at the British Council in India. There, introductions over. Now, so decolonization is obviously, it's a huge subject to take on in an hour. And it's not all about repatriation. So I'm going to begin with that, and it is a gimmicky, sort of experimental beginning, but I want to, the question I'm going to ask you, and the show of hands I'm going to ask for, is as much about the power of this kind of civilized sort of disagreement that we may have, the power of it potentially changing your mind within the hour. So I want to ask you the same question now and at the end. It's not at all representative of the discussion we're going to have. It's a bit gimmicky, and it's about the Elgin marbles. How many of us think that the Elgin marbles need to be taken out of the British Museum and returned to their home in Greece, their original home? We'll have a show of hands. So I'm going to actually count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 17, 18. Wait a minute. Let's do it the other way. Who thinks they should just be left in the British Museum or in Britain? Okay, people, so we have to, there's a potential for changing about 7 minds here within the hour. Why do we need to decolonize in the first place? And what do we mean by it? What does it mean to you? I'm going to come to you guys, but I'd like to ask you that first. So, you're here for a reason. You're here to discuss decolonizing galleries, decolonizing the heritage sector. What does it mean to you to do that? Anyone? What does decolonizing mean to any of us then? Warm us up, Errol.
All right, okay. First of all, I want to say that I think this is one of these very interesting moments when a word is introduced, as migrated, as it were, from one discourse to another. So the word decolonisation traditionally has been used to describe empires that have been under the control of a foreign power and they've gained independence,
okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And this process always means giving up territory, because the word colony refers to a space over which somebody has control, right? So what I find interesting, transferring it to the heritage sector, is how that meaning can be retained, because I think that people invoking this term without giving up much, basically, without giving up territory, without giving up power, without giving up control. So my idea is that it's not just about repatriating objects, it's about giving up power in terms of who works in the institution, what kind of shows you're putting on in the institution, how you describe objects, and how you describe heritage. It's a whole series of changes in how the term heritage or museums has been controlled by quite a limited group of people.
Yes, and I saw you sir, nodding furiously at the front. So could I just pick on you and say what, do you agree on what you understand about, and what's your understanding of decolonising?
Yeah, as you said, I think it's kind of broadly about giving up power. It's not only about repatriation, it's about changing the representation of the country, sort of like recognizing kind of each colonial country's past and increasing a representation, and about kind of like informing about true colonial histories.
Okay, so I wonder if we've seen that happen in it to any degree during any visits to who goes to galleries here, who goes regularly? For most of you, who goes regularly to heritage, National Trust, whatever, heritage, to consume heritage? About half of you, half the room. And of that half, let's take heritage first, who's seen or felt a kind of change in the way you just said, across the board, in who greets you at these heritage sites, the people who work there, or the things that you've seen and you've thought, well, that feels different, something's happening here. Who's felt that? Okay, and can you say how?
Yes, Katrina Oliphant. I work with Errol actually, and I'm working with Errol on a project now, but also with the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. And we were looking yesterday, I'm working on a podcast project with a local school, and it's called Labelling Matters. And one of the things that the Pitt Rivers Museum is doing very actively is changing how some of its objects are labelled. There are other ways in which it is also seeking to return goods. We were looking at their part of the Benin Bronze Dialogue. And, for example, there is a display case which is full of items which are owned by a trust. So it is not within their gift to repatriate. But next door, absolutely next door, there is a pair of Benin wooden paddles. And these, I'm sure everybody knows, but these are all objects which were taken forcibly from the Kingdom of Benin. Those are going back. And the label, the narrative on the label relates what happened, the violence of what happened, the fact that these were taken, and the fact they're going back. The label in the adjacent case is so sterilised and sanitised, you would have no idea of what was literally physical rape which had gone on.
So things left out of labels, so a sort of selected version of art history and history is what you're saying, that the change in labels represented for you.
And the power of narrative, I think, is really important, even perhaps more important than the objects, is how they're described.
And there was another hand raised here, when I asked who's seen felt some sort of change.
While you've got a bit of a gap, I think I'd like to pick up the point that you're making, because I think it's absolutely spot on. We need to understand that there are certain narratives that are in place when we go into cultural institutions, and that there are particular people who are writing them. And I think what's really encouraging to see amongst my colleagues and amongst the panel and the museum sector more broadly is that those narratives are starting to change. The main reason I wanted to talk to you right now is because one of the ways in which that is happening is at an exhibition at the Grant Museum at UCL called Displays of Power, which my colleagues and I have curated. Please come along and see it. Shall I go for it? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So if you're saying, we're talking about labels and we're talking about heritage, and I suppose heritage primarily is something that we see in cabinets with labels, and it's all about the past. Is it about the past, Subhadra? I want to ask you this as a historian. Is heritage something that was found and excavated, and now it's in a cabinet and it's telling you about its history? Or can heritage be something less fixed?
I think that idea that objects speak for themselves is something we really need to move away from. If it were the case that objects spoke for themselves, we'd all be on the same page. There would be no disagreement in this room. Even if it is only 7 people we need to bring on board with us, there wouldn't be that disagreement. And if that history was evident, and if it was obvious, and if there was only one of those histories, no, we wouldn't even be having the discussion. What is patently obvious, and what I think that the sector struggles with, for us, time is kind of like our navel. It's like our belly button. It's at the centre of everything we do, and yet we ignore it all the time. For me, the way that I would look at it is, there is really no such thing as the past without it being mediated by us in the present. Objects don't speak for themselves. People speak for the objects. We need to be mindful, as the lady was saying, of the stories that we're telling. Because our current stories are really quite crap, and we can definitely do better.
And then, of course, if you're contesting, one version, you're sort of contesting history, aren't you?
Well, there's not one history, is there? I don't think.
I can just say that the word heritage is in itself problematic because it automatically invokes the past. You're inheriting something, legacy, that's been handed to you from a previous generation. And Stuart Hall, in his essay, Whose Heritage, he actually says, why don't we use the word culture, which is a much more dynamic, living concept. So automatically, I think, once you use the word heritage, you're limiting the direction in which you're looking at.
So that's heritage. What about galleries? What about art collections? Melanie, how would you go about trying to relabel? I mean, that's an immense task with any collection.
Well, I'm not going to speak from a Wellcome collection perspective. There is some work going on in terms of interpretation, but I will talk about a project that I was associated with called Black Artists and Modernism, which was a research project led by the artist, Professor Sonia Boyce. And one of the things that they did, so this was around, there was an audit of national collections to see how many black artists were in national collections, but it was also about reinterpretation, looking at works which hadn't been shown for a while, basically because curators didn't know how to talk about them. They didn't have the intellectual vocabulary to talk about these works. And one of the key concepts of thinking about a reinterpretation of work was close reading of the work. So to stand in front of a work and to talk about it in terms of its aesthetic, textural qualities, and then look at the label and think about how the work had been described. So this exercise took place at Tate Britain, and one of the artists that was looked at was Rashida Reem, who is, I suppose, an elder statesman of modernism, hails from Pakistan, but actually most of his artistic career has been in the UK. So I can't remember exactly what work it was. I think it was one of his sculpture pieces, and we spoke about the work in very aesthetic and formal terms. And then you look at the label, and it's Rashida Reem was born in Pakistan, he trained in engineering, which immediately kind of dismisses his ability to actually produce real art. And similarly, there was a painting by an artist called Donald Rodney, which you could, I suppose, place within the school of kind of abstract expressionism, I guess. And again, it was Donald Rodney, born in Birmingham, of West Indian parentage, didn't really talk about the fact that he was a contemporary of Rosamund Kelsey, a very famous contemporary artist, and produced collaborative works. Spoke about him in terms of his work as a conceptual artist. There was none of that in the label. But interestingly, after this work took place, Tate rewrote some of their labels.
Oh, did they? So really, it's you're talking about pigeonholing of certain artists just within that label. To take it back a few steps, are you seeing shows, art shows, by more artists of colour? Are you seeing greater diversity just on what was the last show you went to that was by somebody of colour, or that dealt with race, or that dealt with something that was challenging that sort of previous norm of what art was for us?
What's your name? I know. Natasha. Yeah. Natasha from the Photographers Gallery. But that stands out as a sort of beacon, if you like, of a multicultural presentation. But the way that it was talked about, I think, is quite important. And I think the idea of the language we have, and the point you made, Errol, about decolonisation and giving up power as well as territory, that was presented as kind of a discrete package, or as an integrated of the cultural offer, as you say. And I sort of struggle quite a lot, because whilst I see a lot of intention to open up the discourse, to flip the script, what I don't see is at the decision-making level any real belief that that is what we need to do. It is about what we want to do in order to get more funding or to reach out to wider audiences. But to me, unless it is a genuine belief that in order to be the kind of world that we would like to be, it is vital and essential to flip the script, to change the narrative, to just discuss different viewpoints and really open up new perspectives, rather than just have them as like, oh, did you see that exhibition that dealt with kind of the black history in the UK from 1951? It still feels isolated and annexed.
I was just saying, can you possibly speak up a bit? So,
Oh, right, yeah. So it's not, yes.
Just linked to that, about saying the exhibitions do feel isolated.
What's your name?
I'm Assad. I'm from Manchester, in case my accent throws you off. There's an exhibition at the British Museum at the moment about Islamic art influencing Western art. And I like to preface this with, I am no artist, so I don't know what I'm talking about, but I have a friend who does. And they informed me that, so I enjoyed it at surface level, just walking around like, yeah, these are nice things. But my friend got really frustrated because it doesn't actually delve into how Islamic art actually influenced Western art in the slightest. It's a lot of just Islamic art, and there's not really any depth to it in that kind of sense. When really that's quite disappointing when you think that there are a lot of things that you can look at, even from an architectural point of view. You look at Spanish architecture and Sicilian architecture, but as well as even when it comes to paintings, there's this very famous depiction of the baby Jesus from the 1400s, and the halo that he has around his head, it has inscribed in it Arabic, the first half of the Declaration of Faith, and that was taken as a direct imitation of contemporary Islamic art. But that wasn't delved into in the slightest, and just became a bit of, oh, here are some things that Muslims made over the years. But there was no real link to what happened today, aside from like, oh, here's a painting from a Western artist of an Eastern figure. But there was no actual interaction, it was more, here's this. And as a result, it did feel just quite out of the blue, like annexed. There wasn't really much depth to the point of it. And considering it was in the British Museum, I was expecting there to be a bit more. I was quite excited to go, but then it fell quite short.
Thank you for that. Has anyone got any other, who's last been to a show that has promised you some inclusion, diversity?
I just wanted to
What's your
Lucy,
name?
by the way, from London, and I went to the Wallace Collection to see an exhibition curated by William Dalrymple, showing English painters, but also Indian painters. So they were patrons for, and I thought it was very well balanced in terms of yes, there was some biographical content in the label. I mean, you can't expect too much of a label after all, and I think one is allowed a little bit of biographical context. I know it's a bit of a dirty word at the moment, but people do. It does help as a starting point. But it was very well balanced between. Some was Enlightenment painting that the Indian painters had. They'd absorbed Enlightenment European techniques, but they were also proposing their own take on art and the culture that had influenced them. So I felt that it was mutually very reinforcing and enlightening, and there was no patronising. There was nothing that smelt bad about it. And it was beautifully displayed with huge love and attention by William Duck. You could tell the passion. So I thought that was I recommend it.
Really? Yes.
Can I come back about your point about the biography? For decades, black artists or artists of African and Asian descent have forever had their work read through their biography, not through their ability to produce, I'm going to sound a bit hyperbolic, but great works of art. That's the challenge, I think, for an artist showing in a museum who's an artist of colour, that somehow describes who they are, because, and what it reveals is a lack of knowledge about their work. And one of the things that Sonia Boyce says, she went to art school in the 80s, and she said, well, I went to art, my contemporaries are, Errol, you might have to help me out here, Damien Hirst is probably a bit too young.
Well,
for her. But,
before the YBAs, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
so Turner Prize nominated artists. She was taught by the same tutors, she had the same experience, but her work is understood in a very different context and is written about differently, partly because people feel they need a separate set of tools, a different language to understand that work. And it's fundamentally ignorance about her practice and wanting to read it in one particular way. So Sonia made an amazing body of work, some of which is held in Tate Britain, which were a lot of self-portraits about her relationship to empire, about her relationship to the Caribbean, about the Caribbean's relationship to empire. Her work has moved on quite significantly now, where it talks about performance and appropriation. But people are challenged by that because they can't read it as in terms of a black person representing themselves in relation to empire. And the challenge for her, I guess, because of that work, which was really groundbreaking, is for her biography not to determine the kind of work that she does now. So I think we have to be careful when we think about the importance of biography because, quite frankly, white artists, particularly male white artists, aren't written about in the same way. That's just a fact. And you can go and do some analysis yourself in a museum to look at those labels to see how that has been enacted through interpretation, written by mostly white curators, I have to say.
That's something to point out here entirely, is that we're talking about an exhibition curated by William Dalrymple at the Wallace Collection. This is a white man who has a certain access to certain privilege and has been given the space in which to do this. I can name you several curators who are not white men, who are just as expert in the material that you would have seen, who don't have the same access to be able to share their stories in the same way. So there's inherent power play involved in this too.
Yeah. I think that way of talking about artists is a sort of something, it's the legacy, I guess, of how history was discussed and how people of colour were talked about through history and the way in which the foundations of our museum collections were formed. Because, you know, the bulk of our national museums formed their collections in the 19th century during the height of colonial rule. And if you read the labelling of objects now, although many of them have been updated and researched again, there's still the legacy of that language because the language used by the people who collected those objects has been inherited by labels, by object records, and hence by literature, by the way in which we educate people about history and collections. And I did an exercise in rewriting the introductory label to the India Gallery of the National Museum, which was published in a book by the Delphina Foundation last year. And it was interesting because when I talked to curators of that collection, they perceived that language as being neutral. And if you read the guidelines on how to write exhibition or display text, it says it has to be factual. And this approach sort of obscures the fact that the language, the substance is actually very subjective and very pro-colonial. So, for example, in this particular text, it said that this collection, which was largely formed through members of the British Empire going to South Asia and collecting objects, many of which wouldn't have been paid for, would have been acquired under duress or undervalued at the time. In this label, it said that the collection had been formed as a result of hundreds of years of cultural exchange between Britain and the East India Company. This is like revelatory. Yeah. And this is perceived as being neutral language.
So there's all of that. There's also there's this, the question of, you know, do we need more shows that show the works that tackle decolonisation or tackle at least race, or just present work by people of colour. So there's the art side of this and what's showing, but then there's also, people have touched on the people involved in the arts, from the curators to the receptionists to the programmers to the directors of galleries. So what's more important, that structure of workforce or the shows that are put on? I mean, of course, they're symbiotic.
Just before we head on to that because I know that your expertise speaks to this way more than mine does. But I'm mindful of what you said about talking about race in public. In this country, we are useless at talking about race in any kind of meaningful way. And just to pick an example out of the air, let's say for the sake of argument, the Elgin marbles. And we're well aware how those objects are put in the centre of a heated repatriation debate. It's not that heated, it's been the same argument for the last 30 years. But the thing that we don't talk about is why did Lord Elgin want to bring Greek sculptures from the Parthenon to England in the first place? And the answer, briefly, is that the bodies represented in those sculptures were seen at the time to be at the absolute height of racial progress. And this is what the main concern was in Britain, was that the British people saw themselves, the English rather is probably a more accurate way to say it, saw themselves as the natural cultural and physical, i.e. racial inheritors of the ancient Greeks, and that is why it was important for those sculptures to remain here. Now, when you know that bit of the story, which I have to admit I had no idea, I did a degree in museum studies, we talked about sending the Elgin marbles back, never talked about why they came here in the first place. So it's really important that we start to have this conversation in more meaningful ways. My subject happens to be the history of scientific racism, but it's easy enough to write that into a label. Go have a look in the British Museum. It's not in any of the labels there.
Who wants to see more people working in the arts, or who wants to see?
Do you mean a change to the actual
structure? Yeah.
Infrastructure?
Well, from the curators to the programmers to the directors. Who wants to see many more? Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I want to see that what you were just talking about, but with that change, you also, because Errol mentioned culture, and there has to be a shift in culture. There's no point putting people in across and they're still feeling unwelcome or not feeling empowered on certain subjects, knowledgeable and things like that. So it's a whole culture shift within the cultural sector.
And what do you mean feeling unwelcome? Because that's significant, I think. What do you mean by that?
Or just feeling unwelcome.
You want to introduce yourself and say what your job is.
You don't have to. Yes.
So I'm a principal curator and a marine biologist at the Natural History Museum. Worked with the Badger, we've written a paper.
We don't need to talk about that.
I'm just trying to pull you back in. But yeah, so...
but I'm trying to ask you, who do you think feels unwelcome? Who are we talking about? Is it people of colour? Is it people of a certain class?
It's people of colour. Things are subtle in the industry. When I use that term, feeling unwelcome, it's just not feeling quite at home as you would be amongst other people that you know, the black community and things like that. And it shouldn't have to be. At the end of the day, I'm a curator trying to get on with my work. I shouldn't need to deal with those other surrounding issues or feeling that, oh, I'm the only black person at the table and they're making these decisions on exhibitions, narratives and labels, and how much energy that takes to kind of talk to the issues that need to be said, and you're the only one in the room that can say it. It's exhausting. So right, so I'm going to talk personally. I feel personally, I'm always putting myself in other people's shoes, the people that I work with, surrounded with. It needs to shift, the culture needs to shift, and it needs to go the other way.
So we need the demographic of that of the meeting, that sort of internal meeting to change, do we? We just need many more people of colour in the room.
Absolutely, but also feeling able to speak and feeling...
Yeah, and have power as well when you speak. Sorry, I'm getting really passionate. Have power too, as well. Not just in the title, it's like actual power that you're going to be listened to if you speak.
And quotas might come into that, but before we got onto that, there's a comment there and a comment there.
So I'm Sina and I work across different museums and galleries, mainly in education. And what Miranda just said is really true. I agree with it, because if there isn't a shift in culture, then nothing is going to change. And I work in several organizations, as I've already said, but one of them I tried to tour guide once, and it was an artist, it was an French-Algerian artist I had very much the same, I mean, not the same, but very similar lived experience, and I was on fire about his work. I was so, you know, interested in doing the interpretation, and basically I was turned down repeatedly, and in the end I just felt silence. I just felt, you don't want to hear my voice, right? And they wanted people to read very dry information about this person, when in fact there were pictures, photographs of transgender people who lived in Paris in the 90s, which was the, you know, I was in the whole squat scene, and, you know, I've seen all this world. I knew this world. They didn't want to hear my voice. They wanted to hear the person who got it from a book, who got it from someone else, who got it from really dry knowledge. And this organization, they will insist on how progressive they are. Of course they do. So it's quite frustrating, you know, because you get to feel like you're mad, you know, and you're a bit too much, really.
Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
What's
your name?
My name is William. I'm from Magnet Photos. I was thinking whether decolonization is enough, and whether the conversation should be bigger than decolonization. It should be about unlearning imperialism, because we actually never talk about the fact that imperialism can exist without colonialism. So the whole systematic change should come from the fact that we should talk about unlearning imperialism. And even though repatriation is the first step, and it's a very important step, we need to address the emotional trauma that a lot of these communities experience, that their looted objects are in the British Museum, and everybody in this room have the privilege to go to the British Museum, while a lot of people are not able to come to the UK and see their cultural heritage. And how do we address dismantling borders is the main question that we need to address in decolonizing.
But how do we get over the trauma of these people, you know, people finding loot in the British Museum, just from the room, first of all, you know, or do we send it back?
So for me, we went
What's your
to
name?
LA. I'm at the National Trust, and I avoid the British Museum like the plague, hate it. And we had to go there.
Could you speak up?
Okay, so as a Nigerian, when we went to see the Benin sculptures, I didn't actually realise that the marks on the face were significant, because it's tribal marking. And then I saw that at another show that I went to, and there was no interpretation about that at all there. And it was sort of, it's just very frustrating to just see it just in the basement with nothing around it.
This is the British Museum?
Yeah, and it's just very patronising to see it there. And that's my feeling, is that it sort of treated us less than.
So this isn't even about sending back loot. It's about the way, or if you want to call it loot, art. It's about how that art is presented in the first place, and the things that are missed out. Is that what you're saying? The things that are left out.
I think it's the point that they wouldn't even know that it's missed out because it's not theirs. So it's almost like if I'm telling a story about your family and I miss out whole chunks because I don't know the story of your family. I don't know the significance of it. So when it even comes to the interpretation that's being put onto it, they can't do it properly because it's not theirs and it wasn't included in the knowledge in the first place.
So this is something that's a few people... Is there an othering going on? Is there a sort of objectifying, here are the Benin sculptures, here they are in all their exotic glory, but actually... And I think you seem to suggest, sir, a similar thing, that the exhibition you went to lacked depth because it was just presenting, it wasn't actually doing what it said on the tin.
No.
It wasn't comparing, it wasn't really engaging, it was just saying, here's some Islamic art.
Yeah.
So how do we stop... sorry, there's a question there. There's a question here and then one there. Not a question, a comment.
My name's Dano. I'm a trainee at Culture and with Errol, so I try not to embarrass him. I agree with a lot that's been said today. I think what really stands out is kind of having I really agree that we're really bad at talking about sort of race in this country. Like there isn't like a real like honest discussion about the dynamics between different races, and I think that affects how people sort of portray themselves like professionally. I feel that even when galleries and museums do take a sort of, they try and make a move to be sort of inclusive, but it always comes off patronising because they're not being honest about like who they are. I doubt that there's a room of like museum directors now having a sort of discussion with, like we're having now, like with the same sort of energy, same sort of vigour, about really trying to like repatriate items or really trying to like be inclusive. Sorry,
go on.
Yeah, and I fully agree with Ellie as well. I think that when we went to the British Museum and yeah, all the African stuff is in the basement and it's dimly lit. And just as Africa, it's just an arrow pointing down.
Yeah.
Africa. And it's the same stuff.
So you're saying, and then you say as well. So there's 1, 2, and 3 here. So please remember the order. But so you're saying it's not just a question of repatriation, having a conversation about sending back or keeping. Yeah. It's having a question about race, is it?
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like sometimes when galleries do this kind of thing, they are being a bit they sort of infantilise the culture that they're living at. So I've also got to say that, just to cover like my back, I'm a huge fan of like European avant-garde, like sort of stuff. I mean, there really needs to be like a real sort of conversation about all these different aspects that sort of brings together, all these different aspects that of why we're here today.
Thank you for that. There was a comment from that end.
I was pointing over there. That video, number 2. Hello, Charlotte Woodhead from Warwick Law School. I think the first stage, it seems from what's been said, is about the narratives, but it's also about acknowledging the wrongs as well that have happened, and that is an important part of telling the story, but actually acknowledging that what happened was wrong. But then, in terms, I think, to me it seems that repatriation is then the next stage of the discussion, because at the moment the national museums cannot repatriate. They are legally prohibited from doing so. So there's another battle then to change the law in order to facilitate that. So therefore repatriation isn't always the first step. It can be done at the likes of non-national museums, local authority museums, university museums who have the legal means to do so. But there's another whole debate that's got to be made as well, and persuaded, after acknowledging the wrongs. So I think it feels almost like there were stages in the process, and repatriation is sometimes jumping the gun because it can't always be done, but it needs to be acknowledged that it needs to be done.
I 100% agree with that. I'm busting to get in if you don't mind. So if you read Miranda in my paper, acknowledgement is the primary thing that we're talking about in a science museum context. The thing about the law is that the law can change, which is why it's so encouraging to see so many people in this room, because opinions change and then the law changes. Until, 3 years ago, it was illegal to repatriate paintings stolen from Jewish families by the Nazis that were part of the national collections in Britain. That law changed. We're going to be able to, we can change other laws as well. So it's very important for people to understand that just so often the legal argument is the one put forward. We'd really like to give those things back, but it's against the law.
Yeah, but the problem with that is in the past, when you look at attempts to reform the British Museum Act, which have happened at various stages over time, the immediate thing is that it focuses on the Parthenon marbles. And immediately that is the sticking point, and that stifles the debate about it. And that has to get over. Even when they were debating in 2009 the Holocaust Return of Cultural Objects Act, even then they said this is not about the Alban marbles, this is not about the Parthenon marbles. And so it's all that was the preface to it.
This is how invested we are in white supremacy, that we want to keep hold of those things.
So I want to come to this speaker and then I want to come to you with the stripes, and then you. Thank you.
I'm Simon, and I work at the Wellcome Collection, so similarly I don't want to embarrass anyone. But I just think that a lot of these points are really, really interesting, really, really valid, but they really importantly come back to that core point about when knowledge is created or was created in the 19th century idea of museums, because so many of these things, let's take the Rapa Nui statues, I put quotation marks around them, the idea being that they are statues as opposed to that community's belief that they are living members of that family. This is a really integral difference between repatriation and as a result of a decolonised way of thinking, because really you only get to that point of understanding why this thing needs to go and be in a different space when you understand that our knowledge is created within a context of 19th century and Enlightenment ideas of what knowledge is and what it exists to provide.
Thank you. Who's the hang on. Who was next? You. What's your name?
My name's Cara. This is to do with sort of like whether or not we should repatriate things, and to do with like acknowledging the wrong. If something like the British Museum were to repatriate everything that had been wrongfully taken, obviously their collection would be completely non-existent. But something that they could do to acknowledge their wrong is sort of like validate the acquisition, not by like justifying why it was taken, but like when you have something like the National Gallery, when they make a new acquisition, it's because they've bought a new painting from another gallery or museum or whatever. And if big institutions which had taken these items within their collections were to somehow, I don't know, this is obviously very flawed, but like make some sort of like negotiation and actual deal so this has been purchased, it's no longer a looted item. And by that I also mean like being items which are on display, not the many, many ones which they have in their basements and their collections which aren't on display, which then I think, what is the point of having them there? They should be repatriated. But so this idea of validating this acquisition and making it proper acknowledges it was wrong a little bit and then also justifies the continuance of these items belonging within that collection, within that space, outside of like.
Sorry, so do you mean reparations? Do you mean actually paying for the Parthenon marbles then?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a possible. And who thinks that's a way forward? Yeah.
Oh. I'm Natalie. I would just say that what if they don't want to be paid for them? What if they just want them back? Then what do we do?
Exactly. What about the idea of pricelessness? Like
No, of course. But there is also something like there are lots of people who live within the UK who don't have the opportunity to travel abroad and see all these things. It doesn't mean they're not interested in other culture. And I do think that they should have access to other culture. And the same thing goes for like any other country where they have works of art which are from other cultures and stuff as well. I'm not saying that if the British Museum were to just like pay everyone off, that means they get to keep it. I'm saying that like that should be something which maybe people could consider, obviously, if both sides of this story are consenting and actually wanting to do that.
I think there are concerns about the we're still looking at it argument. So if everyone was, funny enough, comedians seem to deal, not me, but other comedians seem to deal with this better. So if anyone's seen James Acaster talking about the stuff in the British Museum, the argument that, no, you can't have it back, we're still looking at it. He is very good. To problematise the very serious concept that I'm now making light of, so I don't mean to do that to you, apart from the fact that I disagree with your argument, is that, yes, it's not always so straightforward as just giving things back. I work with human remains, and in the stories of repatriation of human remains, going back to places like New Zealand, or going back to places like Australia, or going back to Native American communities in the US or in Canada, the fact that these people were taken without any reference as to who they were and where they came from means that they are tainted in ways that means that the people who may be their descendants don't necessarily want them back. This is a complicated process that needs to be spoken through. I was at a conference in Leiden a few months ago, and there was a Dutch curator there saying he'd done this repatriation to some Maori communities, and what they'd done is, in return for having their skull back, they had given him some glass beads. And his response was, please don't give me more things to catalogue. It's like, I don't want anything back, I just want you to have it back. We're not bad people anymore. Here, have your people back. He was completely missing the point, which is that it's reciprocity. It's a relationship. It's not about the things, it's about the exchange. It's about building those relationships with people. So monetizing it, I don't think necessarily is the solution. I feel capitalism is very much a problem. And dismantling capitalism is as much about decolonising as anything else is.
There was a hand up here, and actually I've forgotten you, I'm sorry. So perhaps you could go first. And who was the hand up here?
It was mine, but it's been answered.
Okay, there.
Hi, so I'm Veronica. I'm a writer and a facilitator with a particular interest in archives and kind of community stories. Just to take a slightly different, kind of flip the discussion slightly, maybe we're trying to retrofit institutions that don't deserve this much attention. When you've got places that have so much of our public money pumped into them that don't really reflect kind kind of modern Britain, and certainly don't reflect me. And we're talking about decolonising them. You know, there's the old thing about, can the master's tools ever dismantle the master's house? Why are we not just investing in our own museums and galleries? Maybe we need new institutions. When you've got somewhere like the Tate that can afford to invite in, you know, a cool collective to run a late, to fill their place with black and brown bodies that are never there any other time, unless they can afford £25 a ticket to go see Soul of a Nation. A lot of my contemporary people that I know can't go. But then down the road, you've got the BCA at threat of being closed and not being supported, the Black Cultural Archives. Maybe we're asking the wrong question.
Okay, thanks.
Very quick point, something that Miranda, I'm George by the way from the Photographers Gallery, something that I think Miranda said, it sounds like imposter syndrome. It's possible to have the skills, the qualifications, the flair, but be in an environment where you don't feel welcomed. I think the issue is being represented in all cases. So in boardroom, in meetings, front of house, but also external things, so staff training, having black people there who are able to facilitate these things, or brown people there, or people of colour who are able to facilitate these sessions. It's not just about having black people speak up when it's a black thing or a black exhibition. It's about being included in the conversation regardless.
And how do we do that? Because that's a great idea, but how do we actually do it? How do we
Literally what I just said. Whenever there's a staff meeting or there's an external meeting, I think we should potentially pay more attention to having black or brown facilitators to host that meeting or to host that workshop. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it starts at the top down, does it not?
I think both ways.
Boards appoint directors and directors appoint.
1 minute. So there and there.
I'd just like to briefly disagree with what he said slightly. He said it sounds a bit like imposter syndrome, but I've noticed this more and more going on, because I think the main point was that it takes a lot of energy to be the only one in the room who can, quote unquote, represent any group of people. But on top of that, even the way that you speak, so I've noticed, and every ethnic minority that I know goes through the same thing, we speak differently depending on who we're with. But that never happens the other way around, and that's the key thing I want to say here. Like, if I'm talking in a room full of white men, I will speak in a particular way. If I'm in a mixed group, then I will be completely different in like the language that I use and like my vernacular. But even that can be very exhausting. So in my current role, I'm a management consultant, so sorry if you hate me. The people I'm talking to are consistently white men, and as a result, I always have to adapt my way of talking so that they understand. And it never happens the other way around. So
unless you're Michael Gove trying to be Stormzy.
He was not sent them one copy.
Or Kim Kardashian.
That's a really, so the thing is, we were talking about this as the panel, there is a consensus here, I hope, which is that diversity is a thing for white people. Every black person, every brown person that works in a museum does the exact thing that you were describing. We code switch, we are exhausted, sometimes we feel like imposters, sometimes it's exhausting being the only one in the room. And we deal with diversity every day because we deal predominantly with white people.
So do we need quotas? Do we need numbers there?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Why?
Absolutely not, because once you reach that
if
number,
you're the only person in the
once you
room.
reach that, we need 100 black or brown people to do this job, and you reach that number and you think you've done the job. That's
I think
the
in
problem
my
for
sector,
me.
I think in my sector we definitely, in design and architecture, we do. I curated an exhibition for Triennale, Lisbon Triennale recently, and it was to do with decolonising architecture, and it was the only thing in the entire Triennale across 6 of the national museums in Lisbon, and it was the only one that represented anyone of colour. And when I joined ICON, 90% of the contributors were white men, and the others were white. And I feel that if there was a target in place, at least it would edge things towards some kind of change. And because I'm there, it's changed. But that shouldn't just be me that has to do that. And I feel that, And a previous editor said to me, oh, but where are all the diverse writers? And I feel that without some kind of pressure from somewhere, whether it's grid or something,
but the pressure might be.
How the
pressure might be demonstrated elsewhere. Sorry, I know you want to say something. Can I just make a very quick point?
Yeah.
Which is, I was at a round table talking about workforce diversity, and there was a lot of hand wringing. How do we do this? How do we do this? And I was saying, well, don't don't reinvent the wheel and stop having the same kinds of conversations. I've slightly lost my thread, so I might have to when I come back to that point.
I've promised a few people. So here, there. Who else did I promise? Okay.
Well, I think it's just simple to say that was the point I was trying to make earlier about this being a genuine need and a cultural impetus to fully be an intersectional society. Without that, it just does become quotas. And without that, what I'm hearing a lot across the room is this burden of responsibility, this burden of representation, which means that you cannot exist outside of that consciousness. And that seems to me it to defeat the purpose. Is that, and actually I think it was someone over there made this point about the model of knowledge, the model of these museums is based on a very antiquated and privileged system. And I think it was you, which I entirely agree. Why aren't we just looking not just to decolonise, but to completely move out of the systems that seem to contain and cause us so much trouble, and we don't seem to be able to work out how to break down those systems yet. So to me, then you build a new bloody boat.
But you probably need a lot of money for that.
There are people already doing it, they're just not supported.
Yeah. Okay. But maybe it's not just about the money, it's about our expectations. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, sure, thank you. Yeah.
I was just going to respond to your question about quotas. I'm Chienza, by the way. And I agree with you, Melanie, that I don't think quotas are the way, because numbers can very easily be skewed. So coming from an arts background and working in arts institutions, I've worked at one where you have two separate parts of the organisation. So you have all the front of house staff, so all the visitor service assistants, all the cleaners, and then you have all the people making the artistic programming decisions. And if you put those two groups together, you may have, let's say, you could easily say we employ 40 people, 40% of people from diverse backgrounds. But then if you look at the office, I would be maybe one person on a floor of 100 who's a person of colour. So numbers can very easily be skewed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with Melanie to a point about being subtle about numbers, but there are some shocking statistics, and I think that managers need to be reminded of them. I don't think that it's acceptable that in London, right, you've got nearly or over a third of the population from minority cultural background. You go into a museum and it's 2%, right, when you walk into a museum. So I think that there should be some managers and arts organisations should be put under pressure to reach a population level that reflects the local people.
Yes, to go above and beyond.
But I agree, it's not enough per se.
Yeah.
Although I was said, for the same reason, I'm pro some sort of statistical pressure. I don't think it's enough on its own.
No.
There has to be an endemic, a systemic change, and I think, just saying this really briefly, lots of people want to speak, but I believe that begins at the top, and I think until leadership shifts, I don't think there can be a cultural shift, because I don't think there's a genuine will. I mean, there are national museums of this country who are not present today because they probably would dissent in terms of the conversation, but who have openly and publicly said that they don't believe in decolonising, that they feel that to decolonise is to decontextualise, and they are not in favour of this movement. So I think until leadership changes, this conversation can't really shift in a genuine way.
Thank you. There's two last questions, and we do need to do the end tally of those 7, and then wrap up.
Gives a little overview of the new museum school. I think it's an incredible program.
Who? Sorry.
New museum school.
Give an overview of the new museum school. You mentioned that he might be able to talk about what.
Yeah. The only problem is we've got about 2 minutes, and there's another speaker there.
I just wanted to follow on the last comment. Sorry, I'm Elizabeth Cooper. I'm currently a historical consultant at English Heritage, and previously I was the curator for the Caribbean and Latin American collections at the British Library, where I curated the Windrush Songs in a Strange Land exhibition in 2018. I guess I feel like a lot of what we're talking about is coming around this question of power. These are power-producing institutions, and if they are producing and basically reproducing the status quo, how does that change happen? I mean, I was in a conversation once with Eduardo Galeano, a writer from Uruguay, and someone asked him, how do you speak truth to power? And he said, I don't speak truth to power because power is death. And I don't know if I completely agree with him, but I do think that there is this question of if it's not what's called in the States affirmative action, if it's not numbers, if it's not quotas, what are we looking at for the change that I think the majority of the people in this room seem to want to happen? How does that change?
The change is already happening.
Take place.
I'm curating exhibitions at UCL, Miranda.
No, absolutely. The work that we're doing is making it happen. I know it's the grassroots. We're doing it. I know, and that's good I think we should affirm that. But I guess I just thought there was a lot of questions about, does it happen in the spaces of galleries? Is that the place where the struggle should happen? Should it happen on the ground? Should it happen everywhere? Should it happen?
This is why this is why I stay in the big house. Is because I live here too. And by the simple
we should have claim over that.
This is why,
Although in terms of workforce, it's not really changing. There is just still one person in the room. So
I think there's the change at a certain level. So at junior level, at mid-level, the Guggenheim has just appointed its first black curator, which is either something to celebrate or to be just astounded at, really. But the fact is, there are the seeds of change, but they're happening at a certain level and not at a senior. I mean, Melanie is an exception. Melanie's appointment is amazing, but things are changing indefinitely in contemporary art.
Yeah. May I just put a plug in for the new museum? About 3 or 4 of the speakers this evening being from the new museum school, which is bringing up a new pipeline of diverse talent that's going to be working in institutions. So I think it is going to change. It is at a pivotal. I think we're at a pivotal point.
So we're at the end of that. That tortoise has arrived at the end, and I just want to do the. Sorry to target those 7, but
have you changed your mind?
Can we just do a hand count of people who don't want to see the Parthenon or Elgin marbles returned and would just be happy for them to stay in the British Museum?
How about if I rewrote the labels for them?
Wait a minute, so there's 1. So that's a triumph of our civilised disagreement because, there's still this...
With the exception.
With the exception. So there's a couple of people in the room, which is absolute proof that we should do this more often as a way of changing minds, or at least engaging with the other side. And it may sometimes, if those 5 people are being completely earnest and not feeling under pressure not to put their hands up, it can, that talking with the other camp can lead to a change of mind. So this has been a huge conversation. It was always going to be too big a subject to deal with in an hour, and I can see why it was a slow and halting start, because I was asking you big questions about what is decolonisation, and we need hours and lots of experts to unravel, even begin to give our version of what that is. And we didn't really give our version. Errol, you helped us to say, to just sort of summarise, to say it's about power. It's about power, and it seemed to be about narratives and filling in the blanks and rewriting narratives. But there are certain lines that sort of have stayed with me, and they're not exactly heartwarming. But this idea of being welcome and unwelcome, that the speaker over there, the unwelcomeness of the institution, and also being the only person in the room, and the burden of representation, of representing. So there's that line, the only person in the room. There's a couple of people talked about sort of the fact that they're seeing, we seem to be seeing more shows around diversity, but they're presented in a way that they're not really engaging, they're displaying. It's a performance of perhaps diversity, is what some of you suggested, that they're shallow, that they leave out great big, quite hurtful blanks that only some people can recognise, but the major narrative just absolutely obfuscates over any meaningful detail or any profundity when it shows works like the Benin statues or Islamic art. It can't be bothered with nuance or depth. So it does, what you were suggesting, it is really a display. Somebody said, diversity in the arts is for white people. That's another thought that has been repeated in the room. So the glaring omissions and the othering. So even though we're seeing more work, seeing diverse art, it's being shown in a way where you still feel it's the other. And repatriation, you all seem to have very strong and very clashing views, and that was interesting. the idea that I think some people suggested was that it's not as simple as returning, it's not as simple as perhaps even paying for or paying back. That actually repatriation is a really complex dynamic, and it's not. You know, I know we all put our hands up. We had this great majority of everybody putting their hands up saying, yeah, send them back. But I've learned in the room that perhaps it's not even as simple as that. It's just a bigger conversation. And the thing that I think is at the heart of this, or that some people said was the heart of this, was that this conversation about decolonising art is really ultimately a conversation about race in Britain. And somebody said it's about unlearning imperialism. And then you seem to suggest that Britain doesn't really do conversations on racism, on race or racism and imperialism. So how do we decolonise the arts if we're not going to be able to have a conversation that lies at the root of that about race and British history in relation to race and art? So unlearning imperialism. Conclusion is that. How do we unlearn imperialism? That could be the next thinking. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry if there was no conclusion and perhaps lots of frustration. I felt it as I was hearing comments, but I still think there's something that was very alive in the room in having a discussion like this. So thank you all for coming, and thank you all to the speakers.
Well, I mean, I think your appointment is like
there you go.
Celebrate.